During the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt started what's referred to as the New Deal, which was an effort to use the government to promote the general welfare, to provide services for those that couldn't help themselves, to use the power of the government for the people rather than for the businesses. This is sometimes called the birth of the welfare state. Other people would like to refer to it as creating a social safety net. So sometimes the standard would refer to this as the welfare state. But we're talking about the New Deal in the 1930s going into the 1940s. It wasn't really all that necessary throughout the 50s and 60s because the economy was in the middle of the long boom. When Lyndon Johnson takes office in 1964, when Kennedy was killed, he is reelected. So he serves about 5 years in office. Johnson starts what's referred to as the Great Society, which is an extension of the New Deal. It's a growth of that welfare state. The Great Society had many different programs, which we'll talk about, but it was also known as the War on Poverty. So it was an effort to provide help to those that didn't have the ability to help themselves. Now, Richard Nixon is going to take over in 1968 for a number of different reasons we'll get to. But in this particular indicator, what we need to look at is a comparison between Lyndon Johnson's programs in the Great Society and Richard Nixon's programs following the Great Society. Now, Nixon doesn't really dismantle these programs. He doesn't take them away, but he has his own set of priorities and his own goals, which we'll need to look at here. So the party affiliations of the Democrats are going to change at this point, as well as the Republicans. Their goals are going to change, and we're going to need to see how that impacts things throughout the coming standards. Lyndon Johnson had been the Senate Majority Leader prior to becoming John F. Kennedy's vice presidential candidate. When Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson took office as the president. And he was fantastic at manipulating the votes in Congress in order to get some of the legislation passed that he wanted, including civil rights legislation. He used the memory of John F. Kennedy to push through first the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which said that the practice of discrimination was banned in public areas, and as well as interstate commerce. Now, there's a few things more to it, but essentially it ends the Jim Crow segregation in the South. In 1965, he again used his abilities to push through the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act said that there could be no discrimination based on race, sex, religion. Essentially, what it did was overturn those state-based Jim Crow laws in the South, things like the literacy test, the poll tax, and the grandfather clause. It also, importantly, monitored the states in the past that had abused its voting rights. So some states like South Carolina would have to propose any sort of plans prior to implementing them in terms of voting. A couple of years ago, the Supreme Court gutted that part of the Voting Rights Act, which has had some interesting implications. In 1968, Johnson also passed the Fair Housing Act. Now, the Fair Housing Act banned discrimination in housing sales, rentals, and financing based on race, religion, and sex. The practice of redlining, where certain minority groups were not allowed to get mortgage financing, was a huge problem. It actually persisted even after the Fair Housing Act. There were other issues that led to the Housing Act as well. Johnson also used some affirmative action efforts in government contracts, meaning they would allow certain minorities to have more access to government contracts than others. All of these were opposed by Southern Democrats, which were much more conservative and were the basis, actually, of the Dixiecrats back in the 40s. Again, it's important to recognize that political party doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with everything the party does. The Southern Democrats were different than the Northern Democrats, and the Northern Republicans were different than the Southern Republicans. So we can see that there's a splintering of the political parties here. And somebody like Strom Thurmond, who was originally a Democrat, is going to break away from that party now and eventually join up with the Republicans. So there's a flow among the political parties that is often overlooked going into this era. Johnson's Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were targeted at minority and African-American populations in the United States. However, he did a lot more that was not directly related to ethnic status or racial status. For example, The Great Society is often known as the War on Poverty. And a couple of programs that are still incredibly popular today were started under the Johnson administration. The first was Medicare, which was health care provided by the government for the elderly. The second was Medicaid, which was health care for the poor provided by the government. There are different qualifications for this in each state to some degree, but these programs are entitlement programs, meaning if you fit the qualifications, you're entitled to get those benefits. And it did have the effects of reducing the poverty rate, meaning the percentage of people that were living below the poverty line declined. So 15% down to about 7%, I believe. The numbers might be a shade off. Other programs were also designed to help reduce poverty, believing that education was a key to getting out of poverty and into the middle class and sometimes even the upper class. There was an education program started known as Head Start. In other words, this is an early education program for poor students or students that lived in areas that needed assistance. The government also made its commitment to social welfare much more explicit, meaning they were willing to invest or at least require more social welfare programs. There is a bit of an issue with this in that this is right as Vietnam is hitting its apex. So Johnson really had to choose between guns, meaning fighting the war, or butter, these domestic programs. His refusal to choose one or the other really limited his effectiveness, and there was an issue where inflation started to rise because of this refusal to commit. So there's a few interesting political issues dealing with the Johnson administration. The first is that Johnson's commitment to civil rights really did win over African American voters for the Democratic Party, and it starts the trajectory that we have today, where the Democratic Party really is a party where the majority of African Americans vote for that side. There is, though, an opposition to this increasing size or power of the federal government, more expenditures or costs to the federal government. And that's led by the conservatives. Traditionally, since the 1960s, conservatives believe in having a smaller government that spends a little bit less money and doesn't provide as many social welfare programs. So there will be a resurgence to conservatism with the Nixon administration, but even more so in 1980 when Reagan comes to power. Liberals did object to that guns and butters issue. Liberals suggested that if you're going to require a program, it should be fully funded. But many of these mandates were left up to the local and state governments to fund. So part of the problem with the Great Society program was the inability to fully fund the Great Society because of Vietnam. So the war really came back to haunt LBJ in a number of different ways, this being one of them. As we'll see soon, Lyndon Johnson was haunted by Vietnam, as well as a lot of the civil unrest during his administration. Mostly because of Vietnam and how unpopular the war was, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for re-election in 1968. He argued that if he didn't run, then perhaps the Democratic candidate might be able to save some electoral power and win election. The Democratic Party really split in 1968, and they didn't really have a solid platform. They were divided amongst themselves. And in 1968, this really paved the way for Richard Nixon to step into the White House. Nixon had run previously and lost the 1960 election to John F. Kennedy. He comes back in 1968 promising to end the Vietnam War. And we'll talk about how he does that, or tries to do that. But this promise of ending the Vietnam War is very popular. Almost as important is that Nixon promised to be the candidate of what he called law and order. Now, in the context of the civil rights era, law and order had some deeply troubling aspects to it. By law and order, what he was talking about was limiting the impact of the civil rights legislation to get African Americans back off the street. Yes, there was some element of reducing crime there, but it was what we sometimes call the dog whistle, where the majority white population was nervous about all the turmoil. You had people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael talking about by any means necessary. We've transitioned away from the easy gains of the civil rights movement. Easy, of course, not easy. But those visible gains of the civil rights movement with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are now moving into those economic and social equality issues, which are much more difficult and had turned the civil rights movement down a bit. So this law and order strategy combines with what Nixon called his Southern strategy, where by limiting the impact of the civil rights movement legislation, he got what was formerly a solid Democratic South to turn into a largely Republican stronghold. And this is where the modern map really solidifies, where the South and the Midwest are largely Republican states, and the coasts, New York City, California, tend to be very liberal. That being said, some of the Great Society programs Nixon continued on. For example, Medicare and Medicaid were continued under his administration, and he does do other things to expand government influence. Once Nixon was in office, he did continue on some of the Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid. He also had several new ones that were developed under his administration that really went against some of the conservative principles that the Republican Party did have. The first was that in response to the new environmental movement, Nixon passed the Clean Air and Water Acts, the Endangered Species Acts, and organized the Environmental Protection Agency known as the EPA. Many of the conservative Republicans argued that this was going to limit business opportunities and might actually hurt job growth, but the movement at the time to protect the environment was very strong. Also, one of the issues with the economy was that Vietnam was causing a lot of issues. 5 years after the Johnson administration and into the Nixon administration, we're still fighting the Vietnam War, trying to wind it down. Spending on Vietnam really caused a lot of inflation, meaning that the value of the currency deflated, while at the same time, economic growth was stagnant. It wasn't growing very well. This is what Nixon called stagflation. Now, normally if you have inflation, you at least have an economy that's growing, and if you have an economy that's stagnant, at least the dollar is remaining stable in its value. So you're really getting the worst of both worlds with this stagnant economy. In order to combat this, Nixon does another thing that the conservatives didn't really appreciate, and that was he imposed wage and price restrictions and controls on the economy. This is something that goes against free market principles that were starting to become in vogue in the Republican Party at that point. He also got involved in the Middle East, trying to negotiate an end to the oil embargo of the 1970s that had been threatened by OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, because the United States at this point had become incredibly dependent on foreign oil, especially that oil coming from the Middle East. So Nixon had done a number of things to increase both the size and influence of government during his time. And we're going to see that that's going to have some pretty large implications in the upcoming administrations after his.